Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, May the 20th, 2024. A couple of years ago, we did a show, British journalist Peter Gumbel, very distinguished writer, who wrote a book. And not untypical, citizens of everywhere searching for identity in the age of Brexit that presented Germany as the most enlightened place in the world. In fact, Gumbel was and is so impressed with Germany that he chose to give up his British identity and become a German. It's a very typical theme. We've done lots of shows about it, about the liberalism, the toleration in Germany, and very much in contrast with what's happening in the United States and the United Kingdom and other countries. But not everyone, I think, might agree with that take on contemporary Germany. My guest today, Jacob Kushner, has a new book out, Look Now, a true story of murders, bombings, and a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. The book is already out in the UK to rave reviews. It's called White Terror, a true story of murder, bombings, and Germany's far right. Jacob is joining us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Jacob, before we get to the details of the book, do you disagree with people like Gumbel's observation or argument that Germany now is the most enlightened place in Europe?
It's a good question. I think looking at the free speech debates kind of playing out both in the United States and in Germany with relation to Israel and Gaza might kind of point otherwise. You know, my book, of course, focuses on, a previous time, the 1990s and the 2000s, back when there was actually quite a bit of political speech going on, in the former East Germany and the former West after reunification. I think, to this day, I mean, there are definitely characters in my book who feel far-right characters who feel that they do not have free speech in Germany today. So I think it's interesting, the sort of different perspectives and different people who feel for different reasons within Germany that the space is not really that free in terms of certain types of political speech to this day, but for very different reasons.
I'm not sure if that's the answer to the question I asked, but anyway, I was always under the assumption that Angela Merkel embraced immigrants. Of course, she's no longer around. I mean, she's still alive. Her memoirs are coming out later this year. But she defiantly stood up to the rights of immigrants. Before we get to your story, what's your take on that? Is Germany generally a friendlier country when it comes to immigration over the last, say, 20 years, say in comparison to the United States or even the UK, where there seems to be general hysteria about immigration?
I think it is. If you look at the sheer number of asylum seekers who are Germany allowed to enter, of course, during the so-called global refugee crisis, 2014 to 2016. If you look at Germany's makeup, Germany's history, I mean, there are some cities like Frankfurt, where I believe in Frankfurt, 43% of the population is of immigrant heritage. So in some ways, Germany kind of is this nation of immigrants in the way that the U.S. sort of claims that moniker. Certainly compared to other Western nations. Germany has opened its doors to, or did, during Merkel's time, as you referenced, to immigrants or asylum seekers during the refugee crisis. By comparison, I mean, I think the only nations that are hosting, or at that time hosted more refugees were, like Turkey and Jordan and, neighboring countries to some of these crises that people were fleeing. So no, absolutely. I mean, I think Germany is, deeply shaped and frankly, deeply enriched by immigrants today. It's hard to compare. The United States has a even longer history of accepting and then repeatedly, denying entry to immigrants from different parts of the world. But, Germany is now, as we speak, going through what may be another shift kind of away from this opening attitude, right, which we can talk about with the rise of the resurgence, let's say, of the far-right political party, the AfD, the anti-immigrant political party there.
So if Germany is, as you said, historically at least associated with Merkel, the most enlightened, maybe not everyone would agree with the use of that word when it comes to immigrants, opening its arms generously, especially to refugees from the Syrian civil war and other civil unrest in North Africa and the Middle East. why did you choose to write this book? Because it's the kind of book that conservatives, people hostile to Germany, will latch onto and say, oh, the Germans haven't changed. They're still really all Nazis.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, I think what shocked me about this case is that I feel like the basic, people who haven't studied Germany specifically, I think they either approach Germany from one perspective or the other. Either the perspective that, Germany is still, as you mentioned, this nation of, Nazis, and that's the last we heard. Or rather, that's quite the opposite, that Germany has done so much to atone for the racist horrors of its past. You've talked about this with other guests you've had on, Linda Kinsler, to some extent, Derek Black, looking at kind of the US connections there. But I
Yeah.
mean, so people approach it with one of those two kind of mindsets, I think. And so I was so interested to discover that the truth is a little bit of both, I think. I mean, I was shocked to discover that there was, neo-Nazism and white supremacy was so rife, in Germany, as many Germans were, to discover that this terrorist group that I wrote about in the book managed to pull off all these bombings and killings, which I suppose we'll get into, in the 2000s, in kind of modern day Germany. And that's what Germany has been reckoning with ever since that came out. But on the other hand, I suppose it could confirm those people who say, well, Germany never did fully reckon with, maybe this obsession with reckoning with one aspect of its past. Maybe in doing that, people sort of overlooked reckoning with the present and how to stop, white supremacy or stop any sort of, racist ideologies in the present.
Yeah, you mentioned Linda Kinsler. She was on the show. She's written a much acclaimed book on remembering the Holocaust or failing to remember. As a journalist, you're based in Nairobi. You've written for all sorts of publications, even if you're from Wisconsin. Did you feel a particular responsibility, a sensitivity? We'll get on specifically to the story in Look Away, but about writing about Germany. Do you have any family connections? Have you spent much time there?
I hadn't spent much time there before I started reporting on anti-immigrant attacks. What brought me to Germany was actually that I was in East Africa reporting on violence against refugees and immigrants here when the 2014-16 global refugee crisis began. And I started hearing reports in Germany of attacks on refugee shelters, people setting fire and committing arsons to shelters in their towns so that refugees couldn't move in to their small towns throughout Germany and cities. And so I started going, as someone who reports regularly on violence against immigrants and refugees, I thought, well, it's not only in East Africa that these sorts of things happen. This is happening right in Europe. It's happening in Germany. So I began traveling over there at that time and doing reporting kind of on those attacks that were happening, let's say 2016, 2017, those years, 2018, when attacks against immigrants in Germany really spiked. And so it was during that time that I discovered the NSU, which was just coming out in Germany, what had happened. And so I sort of branched off to this, very extreme example of anti-immigrant violence.
How does it compare? And as I said, we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, Jacob, and then we'll talk specifically about the story and Look Away. But how does the violence against immigrants in Germany compare to violence perhaps in other parts of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, certainly Russia, perhaps even Ukraine? I'm guessing it's less, but perhaps the reason for that is there are fewer immigrants.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, these, first of all, some of the methods of violence are similar. I mean, arsons, I was surprised to learn how common for so many decades in Germany as in other European countries, burning down or even setting fireworks off and just doing different sorts of attacks on shelters for people was very common, which I wasn't as used to coming from the United States in this form of the attacks. But yeah, I mean, I think I think it was particularly shocking to me to discover that this was happening in Germany, right? Because again, I think approaching Germany as, this nation that has attempted, institutionally at least, to do so much to, say that we are, looking back on the past because we are no longer, what we were, what our government was, what we did. I think that remembrance culture that you talk about, is so deeply ingrained that that's what makes it so shocking when this sort of attack happens in Germany, even if these similar attacks do happen in Hungary and, in Poland and these other places.
What about the role of the state in all this? We've done many, many shows, particularly of more progressive Americans who are very critical of the shriveling of the American state. And they look to Europe and particularly to Germany as the model for a more progressive, enlightened America when it comes to more investment in the state and social services and public space. What was your take on Germany in that context, more broadly, not just in terms of the story, but as a place to live, in terms of its quality of life?
Absolutely. I mean, for this book, I interviewed a family, the daughter of one of the men who would be killed, who immigrated, a Kurdish family who immigrated to Germany from Turkey as a child. And she described her childhood growing up in Germany, in Dortmund, and described it sort of as idyllic, and didn't really experience what she didn't feel that she experienced, xenophobia or racism, growing up. There's one incident I described in the book that's the only kind of thing she could possibly remember of maybe a little bit of discrimination by her school teacher when she was very young one time, and kind of moves on from that. And so, I mean, everyone has different experiences, right? But I think, yeah, I mean, compared to other countries, I think, for many immigrants that I have spoken to in Germany, until the attack for which I was interviewing them, until that point, some people felt comfortable. Not everyone. There was, I remember, a Ghanaian immigrant in the town of Dresden who I was interviewing, because Pegida, this far right movement, had been organizing these protests every week in Dresden. This was probably started around 2016 or so, if I recall. And he said, no, every night, every Monday when these demonstrations happen, I'm fearful, and I avoid the town, the city center, and all of this, because I don't know what these protesters will do. So I think there's a very wide array of experiences that different people have, based on where they are in Germany, whether it's a town like Frankfurt, where half the population has immigrant background, or whether it's a place like Dresden in Eastern Germany, where there are far fewer people of immigrant heritage, and maybe those who are there don't feel as safe.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Dresden and Leipzig, and they are completely different from Frankfurt, from Munich, perhaps even from Berlin. Final question before we get to the break, and then you can talk specifically about this book. How much does this story, this true story of murders, bombings, and a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants, how much does it tell us about the Germany of the early part of the 21st century?
Well, I think it says quite a good deal. I mean, as these attacks were being committed, which we will get into, Germany was trying to decide, again, kind of to your question of, is this going to be a nation of immigrants? I mean, there's a lot of back and forth. Germany famously in the 1990s, early 1990s, passed this asylum compromise, which, severely kind of shook up and limited, immigration from outside the EU. And then, so it's kind of comes and goes in waves. And I think the 2000s, really was this decade of post 9/11, policy, both in the U.S., of course, but really around the world. And so I interviewed people who, in the security intelligence agencies in Germany, who said that event really switched the focus of, okay, immigrants can also be terrorists now, and that kind of association, right? Not that I think the attackers were immigrants per se, but there was that association there. And so, I think the 2000s were kind of this decade in Germany, as in the United States, but to some extent in Germany, where this fear and association of terrorism with Islamist extremists kind of came about, and that's I would argue that terrorism before that had more of a connotation with the far left, with the Red Army faction, the Baader Meinhof group, and that sort of thing. And then the 2000s, it was kind of this reckoning with Islamist terror, association with Islamist terror, and then now, since what the NSU has come to light, through my book and through the reporting of many others, now I think it's finally starting to dawn on people the reality that far more terrorist plots are planned by far-right extremists than Islamist ones or than leftist ones.
Well, the NSU you're talking about is the National Socialist Underground. They're the central organization in your new book by Jacob Kushner. Look Away, a true story of murders, bombings, and a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. I'm going to take a short break now. I want to thank our friends at Liberties, who bring us such great guests as Jacob Kushner. It's an excellent new quarterly journal of culture and politics. Run a short video feature, and then we'll be back with Jacob to talk about the story at the heart of his book, this true story of murders, bombings, and a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second with Jacob Kushner.
The noise, there is nuance, insight, Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Jacob Kushner, freelance journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya, but has a new book out about Germany. Fascinating book. It's called Look Away, a true story of murders, bombings, and a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. In the first half, Jacob, you were good. You were patient with me. You answered my questions about how much Germany has changed. So now the stage is yours. Tell us about this story, this true story of murders, bombings, and this, at least according to your subtitle, campaign to rid Germany of immigrants.
That's right. This is about a case that many in Germany will be familiar with, but many outside of Germany haven't heard of, I believe, and I certainly hadn't, which is this case of the NSU. You mentioned them, the National Socialist Underground. So it's these three friends who form this terrorist group. I mean, first of all, they're neo-Nazis growing up in the 1990s East Germany. At first, frankly, before they become political, with one exception, one of the young men there, Uwe Mundlos, was the son of a professor and had very political ideas from a young age. The other two were not as political, were more just kind of prone.
Yeah, they look, for people watching, they look as if they were created by Hollywood to be neo-Nazis. They have those sort of big ears and short hair.
Yeah, I mean, if you, the three of them came from, I think this is one thing that I learned while I was researching, how these three became kind of radicalized within the far-right scene. They were growing up in the town of Vienna, famous philosopher's town in Eastern Germany. And they, they met each other just after the fall of the Berlin Wall and reunification. And there's this kind of narrative, another narrative that I found not to be necessarily true for these folks that I hear about Germany, and we hear of, there's a reason why, Eastern Germans, due to all of the unemployment and all the hardships faced after reunification, would turn to something like, extremism in some way, or be disgruntled at least, and that sort of thing. But I kind of found, interestingly, that, for these three didn't really lack for opportunities the same way that narrative goes, right? So, one of them, like I mentioned, there on the right, Uwe Mundlos, like he's the son of a professor, and went on to college. He always had jobs and educational opportunities. The one in the middle kind of chose to drop out of school and rather commit crime and whatnot. But his parents were also employed. Beata Zschäpe, the woman of the core trio there, she had a more mixed story in the sense that her father was actually an immigrant. She would become this anti-immigrant terrorist, as we'll discuss. But she was born to a Romanian father who wasn't very present in her life because her mom had studied in Romania at dentistry and then moved back alone. And she actually grew up mostly with her grandmother. Her mom was sometimes employed, sometimes not. So Beata is kind of maybe the one who, half kind of represents that idea of growing up in a family that suffered unemployment due to, in their post-reunification years. But, so these friends, they start out with antics, and, to be honest, if you want to rebel and be angry in 1990s Eastern Germany, there's no more sensational way to do it than become a Nazi, right? I mean, there's nothing more abhorrent. There's nothing. So I think they were attracted first. At least maybe not Moonless.
They could have been Stalinists. That probably would have shocked people even more.
That's true. I guess there are other ways. That's true. These three, they chose neo-Nazism and they embraced it. And
so what does this term gets used all the time, Jacob? I'm always a little skeptical, as you can tell. I'm naturally a skeptical person. What does neo-Nazi mean?
What I mean when I use the term is for these three is, I mean, they literally just embraced Nazi ideas. They worshipped Hess and Hitler. They went to marches every year on the anniversary of Rudolf Hess's death to commemorate him. I mean, they literally just worship Nazis. Sometimes the two boys would dress like Nazis and show up at a concentration camp in an SS uniform.
Were they Holocaust deniers, or did they celebrate the Holocaust?
A little bit of both. Interestingly, I think there was a contradiction there. They, I think as they became radicalized under a far-right leader in the state named Tino Brandt, who's a character in the book, who becomes an informant, actually, I think they started to believe that their views about the Holocaust were being censored, or they were being lied to about the Holocaust. So they came to believe that. But I think first they celebrated it, and maybe simultaneously it was a little confusing. The only one whose political writings kind of survived, a couple of them anyways, is Uwe Mundlos, the one being the son of the professor. And he kind of wrote about more contemporary apartheid at the time in South Africa and, white farmers. So he was very universal. Looking around the world at different ways in which white people were being oppressed in the modern day. But I think, just frankly, when I use the term neo-Nazi to describe them, at least for these three, they were, very much just fashioning themselves as the Nazis had in, the 1930s and 40s.
There weren't, or there aren't many, as everybody knows, Jews left in Germany. Did the Muslims become the replacement for these people, for the Jews?
Interestingly, that it wasn't Muslims. It was, I believe, and as I argue through the book, it was immigrants. Again, they started with anti-Semitism. That's where, I think they're, the logical kind of place to pick up for them was. And so they did make threats against this Jewish leader, Ignaz Bubis, who was the head of the Council of Jews in Germany. And they hung a dummy from the bridge, fashioned to look like him one night, got kind of a threat against him under an overpass he was meant to pass the next day. And so they started with anti-Semitism, but again, maybe for the reasons, I don't want to speculate too much, but perhaps for the reasons you mentioned, that there just really weren't that many Jews around at that time. They did start to focus, actually, not on
George Soros, right? He wasn't.
Yeah, I don't remember that. That's a good question. Like how early did George Soros kind of make it to the far right?
Or the Rothschilds.
Yeah,
we've done lots of shows on that too.
But yeah, so they really fixated on immigrants. And so that's what, the immigrants who were in East Germany from Vietnam and other places, in East Germany, they weren't very visible. They were in the shipping yards, the dockyards, they were, in dormitories, living in those areas. But then after reunification, of course, these families needed jobs as well. These immigrant families, they had to set up businesses, shops, restaurants, all of that. And so they became more visible. So I think, there's an incident where one of the three, throws a piece of cake at a Romani woman. There's all sorts of immigrants or people who are racial minorities, ethnic minorities, who are a little bit more visible, even though there aren't many of them. And so I think that's where their attention started to go.
Throw a piece of cake. That's not a very Nazi thing to do, is it?
No, it's a very
Nazis were in the cake throwing business. When you look at these three people, and certainly their photos, Jacob, they look like classic losers, and they were, as you say, they're from East Germany. They'd been forgotten by history, just as in some ways East Germany had been forgotten by history. They're almost like the German Basil Fawltys of Germany, complete losers, people who are absurd, laughable. Why should we take them seriously? Because there's always going to be, in every country, you could write books about Terry Nichols in the United States. He killed a lot more people than your far-right terrorists in Germany with a single bomb. What's significant about these people, apart from the fact, I acknowledge that they did murder some people, but they didn't murder that many people.
Yeah, they ended up murdering 10 people and bombing, and injuring about 24 people over the years. I think what's striking about them is that, I think today maybe we've become accustomed to what a typical, far-right terrorist attack looks like. In the United States, for example, a white man takes a gun, in a single incident, goes into a Walmart and hunts Mexicans, or a black church and murders worshipers, in a single event, right? And I think
or a synagogue as well. I don't know how many people were killed in that. Was it a Detroit synagogue? I can't remember.
In Pittsburgh, there's one I was referring to, Dylan Roof, who, had a terrorist manifesto, that he had released, so, these are, very classic terrorist attacks. Some of them are suicide attacks, people who, commit suicide in the course of it, although we don't tend to call it suicide attacks unless it's a Muslim doing it. But in my home state of Wisconsin, where I'm speaking to you now, there was a suicide attack by a white man who had radicalized in the U.S. military. He came to a Sikh temple here in just south of Milwaukee, where I'm speaking to you from, and massacred worshipers, thinking them to be Muslims, mistaking them, and then killed himself in the suicide attack in 2012. And so these sorts of attacks, whether we recognize it or not, there is a sort of pattern to them. But what I noticed about the NSU is that they weren't trying to get caught. They were not trying to commit one attack, take credit for it, and be done, one way or the other. They formed this terrorist cell to stay in hiding and to continue committing these attacks. And so that sort of terrorism, that although we haven't seen it much, replicated, lately in the United States, I think there's that fear there of, why not? Why couldn't this happen? In the US, it's much easier to obtain weapons than it was for these folks in Germany, of course. So I think that's kind of what struck me about this case, is that, if this can happen in Germany, it can most certainly, unfortunately, could happen in the United States.
So tell us a little bit more about this group, the National Socialist Underground. The three characters in your book have made them, has given them given the organization and infamy. How many people were members of it?
That's a question that's still being debated in Germany today. I mean, so if you read the book, you'll see that 5 of the members were put on trial, but only one of those 3 core members were, because 2 of the others committed suicide and killed themselves in kind of a dramatic event rather than be captured by police. But then there were 5 people put on trial. So, of course, at the very least, there are, 7. But, some people
Is
argue
that a terrorist group, or is it just 7 losers who sit around drinking beer and plot to kill immigrants?
I think it's very much a terrorist group. I mean, these guys, I mean, they, to last 11 or arguably 13 years on the run, they were on the run from police for 13 years, and they were never discovered during that time. They robbed 15 banks. I mean, they were a very organized set of losers. If all they were a few losers. I mean, they, like to rob in modern day Germany, 15 banks, to commit these, bombings and get away and get, they were never caught during their, murders or bombings. It was actually on the 15th bank robbery that basically they finally got caught. So it wasn't even during the terrorism that they were caught. And so, they were very clever about it. They had these methods. They had people to put them up in apartments or to buy weapons for them, to rent them. They would use a camper van when they would go commit a crime, and then hide away in the camper van after the crime till the police had cleared, and they would get friends to rent these vans for them. I mean, so, there was definitely a network there. And again, there was a trial of 5 of those people. But in the book, what I do is I include a couple characters I follow throughout who I think were very responsible for making their terrorism possible, and who were not put on trial ultimately.
You made reference earlier to Baader Meinhof, the infamous 70s group of German terrorists. Are there comparisons? I mean, the kids in the Baader Meinhof were of usually middle class or upper middle class background. Is there a sociocultural difference between Baader Meinhof and the National Socialist Underground?
It's really interesting. Yeah, in the German consciousness, I think Baader Meinhof is such a big presence. I mean, they hijacked planes, they assassinated, bank executives. They really, they interestingly had some of the same disdain for, I mean, the Baader Meinhof group, I think it was the head of the Treuhand agency that they either kidnapped or assassinated. And that was the agency that was meant to sort of join the East German companies with the West German companies post-reunification. But really what ended up happening is the Western companies bought out the Eastern German counterparts, laid everybody off. And there's a lot of resentment about that to this day. And certainly, these 3, terrorists and their friends, certainly resented that sort of thing. And so, there's actually some shared politics, if you will, at the margins of that. But no, I mean, of course, the Baader Meinhof group was a much more sophisticated, much larger, group of terrorists who committed attacks over an even longer period. And so I think when Germans tend to think of domestic terrorism, I do think that's what they're more likely to think of that group. But again, that group was operating in the 70s up to kind of the 1990s, arguably. And this is sort of more like, I think, the terrorism of today, and that we're more likely to see. And in fact, again, Germany has also seen its share of one-off attacks by far-right extremists that were not terrorist groups, but in Hanau, a few years ago, a white terrorist went into these Turkish, were actually just shisha bars and shot people of, I think, 12 different ethnicities and nationalities, and in a single night, he killed as many people as the NSU did over all of these years. And so, no, to your point, it doesn't take a terrorist group to commit far-right terror. One person can do it in a single night, but it makes you what this group was able to accomplish with the bombings and everything, and the fear that they instilled over all these years, I think raises the question of what other such groups that would like to emulate that, might do. And indeed, they've received attention from far-right terrorists around the world. When Beate Zschäpe, the woman of the group, went on trial, Anders Breivik, the Norway terrorist who bombed Oslo, the government quarters, and then shot all of those, youth on that island from that political party who were on the island of Utoya, he wrote her a letter from his prison cell to hers, calling her a martyr and recognizing her for what she had done. And so I think that kind of signals the sort of the fact that far-right extremists are watching to see how successful the NSU was, and perhaps some are endeavoring to replicate it.
What about the connections between the NSU and other more sort of mainstream radical right movements? There's a headline earlier this month in Politico that German conservatives have broken with Merkel on immigration, become more overtly hostile. Have international rightists, anti-immigrant thinkers, the Steve Bannons of the world, perhaps, Do they have any association with the NSU, or do most conservatives keep away from these people?
No, I mean, both in Germany and elsewhere, I think, members of anti-immigrant political parties are very careful to disassociate themselves with that, with violence against immigrants. And so that's very true in Germany, for example. If you take the case of the AfD, which is, again, a far-right political party that started as an anti-Euro party, but very quickly just became an anti-immigrant party in conjunction with, the global refugee crisis. Kind of using that as its kind of main issue. And so, no, I mean, if you speak to, and as I have interviewed, members of the AfD, for example, in Germany, they, will say, this is not, an effect of our rhetoric, but there are, it is a mix of, social science research that kind of is attempting to determine whether or not, an increase in anti-immigrant rhetoric correlates with an increase in, anti-immigrant violence. And there are some studies that have found that that is the case in Germany in some places, and some that are a little less conclusive. But it's a very interesting question. I think, the other question, here is, what's going on, what's going on with immigration policy in Germany today. And, sure enough, even mainstream parties are, I think legislators just changed a law that no longer allows asylum seekers in Germany to receive cash assistance that they can spend however they wish. They're now restricted. So to like kind of cards they can use at shops and things for food, but they can no longer send that money home to their families who might be suffering still from war and violence in the places they fled. That there's kind of been a movement to restrict a little bit what asylum seekers could do. So again, that's very different from, violence and terrorism. But just to say that society, I think Germany seems to be going through one of these periods where there is kind of an increase in a sentiment against immigration, or at least kind of, trapping it down, thinning it down a little bit. And another interesting facet of that is the new political party that was launched in January. That's actually a left-wing anti-immigrant political party, the Wagenknecht Party, from this former Die Linke, the left leader Sarah Wagenknecht, who kind of broke from the left because there's even on the left there's people who think immigration needs to be clamped down, and kind of started her own party that may win some seats in state parliaments in the September elections that Germany has.
Well, it is a legitimate position to be anti-immigrant, especially on the left, if you're protecting the rights of the working class. I mean, a massive immigration certainly isn't always good for unions or wages. So it's a legitimate position. Doesn't mean you want to kill immigrants, does it, Jacob?
No, very true. No, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish the variety of views on this. I think it's interesting that I mean, the AfD, though, in Germany has used, imagery, and they've used very stark things that are, I mean, they've used, frankly, very racist imagery. I have a piece that came out, I think it was last week in Noema magazine, where I go inside the AfD in Berlin. I was very interested of how is it that in this liberal city, more than 225,000 people voted for the AfD back in 2017 when I was living there in the first election that the AfD was kind of propelled into the Bundestag and everything. And, I ended up going into AfD meetings and getting a tour of, a neighborhood with a lot of refugees by an AfD member to see, show me. I said, what is falling apart here? You describe it as an apocalypse. So show me what's going wrong. And, so if you look at their imagery, they used, like artwork that kind of, in their billboards that kind of portrays a Middle Eastern trader is kind of appraising a white woman and showing that, oh, Berlin's going to become this thing like a slave market or something like that of white women are going to be enslaved. And so they really use very racist tropes. Now, again, I'm not saying that's the same as, violence, but in terms of prejudicial and racist kind of speech and imagery, the AfD has, repeatedly used. I mean, an AfD leader was just fined last week by a court for using a Nazi slogan. There's a lot of kind of overlap there in speech, let's say, or uncomfortable for many Germans overlap in speech between what some members of the AfD are saying and, what, frankly, the Nazis said.
A couple of final questions, Jacob. I know your book touches on the incompetence, or what you perhaps interpret as the incompetence in police of tracking these people down. As you said, there was a rampage for several years. They got away with quite literally murder, several murders, many bank robberies. Was there a degree of implicit or explicit racism within the German police that they couldn't believe that white Germans would be behind this monstrous terrorist group?
I think so, and I think it's a common thing we see, throughout the world of authorities and police forces, being biased toward their, their own beliefs. And so what we saw with this case in Germany is every time the NSU would commit a bombing or a murder, different police departments, they all responded in the same way. They immediately suspected those immigrant families themselves of being responsible. So they assumed that the man who was murdered, the Turkish man, for example, had been dealing drugs, and then they would question the families, interrogate the families, say, just admit that you know what happened, that you ordered the hit, whatever. The police would create these elaborate lies to try to trick the family into admitting them the truth. So police would take a picture of a white woman and say, "Oh, your husband who was murdered, he was traveling to see this woman in this other city and has his own family with her." Police would just kind of make these elaborate stories that they maybe got from watching TV crime shows rather than do real policing, and they kind of did these silly antics just because they, in their minds, they were so convinced that these murders could not be the work of white Germans or some kind of anti-immigrant group that either didn't occur to them or they didn't want to believe that. So instead, they fixated on the idea, the incorrect idea, that all of these murders and bombings were somehow being committed by the immigrants themselves, but there was some sort of code of silence or honor or something, and therefore that kept the immigrant families from speaking about it, which of course is straight out of sort of TV, I suppose. Yeah.
Finally, Jacob, as I said, the subtitle of Look Away is a far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. But of course, as you've noted, it was a handful of people, 7, 10 people, kids mostly from East Germany. They didn't have many resources. Did they really think that they could rid Germany of immigrants? I mean, there are millions of immigrants in Germany, and if not, what do we learn from this? Was it ultimately, historically, what's the value of the book and of the story here?
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely wanted to incite a widespread, nationwide hatred of expulsion of immigrants. And so, Munoz, the professor's son that I wrote about, he wrote about this in his political essays. He wrote how, these attacks would, they hoped, they wrote a letter to like Far Right magazine expressing this as well, how they really hoped that, showing their fellow Germans that immigrants could be killed and attacked would allow people to rise up against them in the way that everybody wanted to, or many people wanted to, but simply didn't feel the courage to act or didn't feel that it could work. And so they thought that, as far as we can tell, they thought that by, committing these attacks, they were going to, inspire a much bigger kind of violence against immigrants. And obviously, that did not end up.
Well, there's a childish fancy. So does Germany come out of this looking better? I mean, let's end with Brian Gumbel's observation that Germany remains the most civilized and civil place in the world. In conclusion, in your book, obviously not all Germans come out of your book looking particularly good, but in overall terms, did Germany survive this NSU outrage? And is it a stronger country now?
I would argue that it is stronger and has learned a few lessons. I mean, it's a very mixed record. So I think the what didn't change is that many of these intelligence heads and police chiefs who were responsible for, or who failed to stop the NSU, some of them, a couple, got turned over to different departments or whatever, or lost their jobs, but no one was criminally tried for negligence, for allowing these, for failing to stop these terrorist attacks or that sort of thing. So from an institutional level, and my book gets into these intelligence agencies.
And you think they should have?
I think there are people. So there's a character in my book, and certainly, there are agents and informants in my book who I think I implicitly argue by telling their story, were I think criminally, could have been held criminally liable. Now, because statute of limitations had run out, maybe prosecutors would have actually, charged them, but weren't able to do the statute of limitations there. But then on the wider scale, I mean, there was a big reckoning with this in Germany. It continues to be. There were laws passed that allowed kind of a sort of essentially hate crimes laws that allow judges to consider, was there a hate motive against a particular group in a modern day terrorist attack, and if so, to sentence people as terrorists and to sentence them for longer sentences, which has happened in Dresden. There was a group called, just outside Dresden, the Freital group, which was attacking immigrants in around 2016 to 2018, and 5 of those members were charged with terror and convicted of terrorism and sentenced to longer sentences than they otherwise would have been. So there were changes, there were reckonings that happened. We also see that in so many far right plots in the military and the police that have since come to light. light. Maybe listeners will remember in December 2022, when German police fanned out across the nation to arrest members of this Reichsbürger group that was going to overthrow Germany in a coup that included, AfD members, included this prince in Thuringia near where these terrorists are from. So, we know about these, and perhaps we know about some of these because there's been a more serious attempt, I believe, in Germany since the NSU to look at far-right extremists in the military and in the police. But then again, these are the ones we know about. How many do we not? So, I think this reckoning is limited in a way in that, we see definitely a reckoning, but, we